Welcome. My name is Keisha Nash Johnson. I am a elementary children's librarian and a public library page. Thank you for coming. Tonight I'm going to talk to you about my Unit 6 graded assignment, which is a collections development debate. The topic of my debate is physical reference sections in the children's space or library. So, first, I'm going to talk about how I, as a children's librarian, support my students with the collection. So, there's a few ways that I do this, and a lot of it has to do with the type of learning that we do. And at my library, we do several kinds. One of them is inquiry based learning. So there are several key components. One is real world relevant questions or problems. Two is questions and investigations that build up students' interest and prior knowledge. And three is interactive investigation using experts in the field, primary and secondary sources, investigations in the field, and presentation of new knowledge and reflection. Another form of learning that I utilize with my kids is problem-based learning or investigative learning. So I design solution to real-world problems. We do project-based learning. We engage in projects that solve or address real-world problems. And we do guided inquiry, where we select relevant topics and are guided through an in-depth research process. The final way that we do learning is connected learning. And there are three principles and three design principles. Some of the learning principles are interest powered. So students pursue areas of interest that are personally relevant, and we foster motivation. And we use the third place theory, which is the three spheres of learning. We acknowledge that there's a home sphere, a work and school sphere, and a public sphere, which is the library. So we make sure that we bring all of these spheres together, because the libraries can be a place of connected learning for interests beyond the classroom curriculum. And so it's my job to make sure that not only do I supplement classroom curriculum, but also I supplement that home knowledge and that school knowledge and the knowledge that my students learn in my space. So we want to provide a safe and welcoming space. So today's question for this debate is, do we need a physical reference section in the children's area anymore? And the reason why I talk so much about the type of learnings that we do is a lot of it is integrated with digital learning. So we're going to first talk a little bit about the pros and cons, and then we're going to end with me telling you what side I'm choosing. You'll probably notice what side I'm choosing by before we get to that point. So, the pros of a physical reference section in the children's library. So, it's an archive of books. This means that it's a wonderful space for children to gain access to books. We archive these books and it's just available. So, it's a space for expensive media that parents and families cannot purchase out of their own pocket. A lot of these books are extremely out of the pay median range. So having or giving access to these books is incredibly important for our students and their growth, mentally. So having this archive of books, a space for the expensive media, and is readily available. So the kids can come and get them whenever they need them, and they can sit down and reference them. And there's something about the physicality of having a book and being able to go through it and investigate that empowers kids, because they're kind of in charge of their own learning. So having a physical reference section is empowering and inclusive and allows the kids to feel, touch, and use all of their senses in their learning process. Also, reference sections are seen as a place of authoritative answers. And I think this has a lot to do with the history of a reference section, being that in the last 20, 25 years, we recently had an internet boom, and the information boom has blown away the way that we access information anymore. It's at the tip of our fingers, when before you would have to go to the library and have to go to a reference section to find particular information. So there is this nostalgia and also this deep rooted concept that a lot of this information um, can only be uh, have authority if it's in physical form, especially because there's so much information that's out there nowadays. But now we're going to talk about the cons of a physical reference section in the children's library. So, as I pointed out at the beginning of the video, I work at a public library as a page, and I work at a school library as a librarian. And I can tell you that in both spaces, neither of the reference sections are currently actively used. My kids don't even know that we have a reference section. I have pointed it out a few times, but they don't venture over there. It's not of interest to them. They don't even know what reference is. And at the public library, the section is integrated with the desk. So when you come into the section, you don't actually see the reference collection. You see the librarian sitting at a desk, and it's behind her, and it's just a amalgam of books that get kind of blended in. So they're not really utilized. A majority of it is actually library science textbooks, and then the little that does get used is generally used whenever the active circulating copies of things like the Guinness Book of World Records, or books for missions project for fifth grade, or for the state projects, or for the U.S. Form fathers or mothers project books have been checked out, which is very, very rare because the public library I work at has a relatively good budget, so it's not getting utilized at all. Another issue is that it takes up valuable space. In my library, it takes up about 8 shelves. So I have 8 shelves of space that I can put active, circulating, high interest books that my kids would check out and would love to have, instead of having these books that don't have any value to my kids and my kids don't even look at. So it's important that I, as a librarian, acknowledge that I have a non circulating reference section. In the public library, it takes up a majority of it takes up a lot more space, and that space can be utilized in other ways. But again, as I've pointed out, there's this history of having a reference section, and I've talked to some of my colleagues about this, other people who also work at elementary library librarians, and they generally find that they cannot get rid of their reference sections. So even if they're having spatial issues, so they actually keep the reference section in their back desk or in small sections, because they have to have a reference section whether or not it's actively being used. And that concept of space, or that concept of having that valuable space for a physical reference section, is somewhat ridiculous given the amount of digital versions that we have now. So it takes up valuable space, not actively being used, but it also takes up valuable budget. These books are not cheap. They're not cheap at all whatsoever. Um, the world books that I showed on a slide prior was said that the copy was the set was about $1,200. Um, if you're a public library that's being government funded, then yes, you have more than enough money to purchase more than one copy of it. But if you're a small school library, or you're just a library that doesn't have that type of money, then you have an outdated reference collection that's not being used because you don't have the monetary means to keep it active. So it takes up valuable budget. These books are not cheap, they're expensive, and they're not being used. Another thing is online search engines. Kids nowadays don't think to grab a book when they're looking for information. They think they're going to just search it on their computer, search it on their mom's computer, search it on their phone. We're so easily accessible to information nowadays that continuing to think that a physical form of information is the only form is outdated. So online search engines are really taking over or really starting to become the forefront of the concept of information. And then there's electronic options. There are electronic options. I'm actually going to exit this for a second and show you that there are, in fact, electronic options. Even on our own San Jose State University webpage, there is an encyclopedia and more option. Um, through the library system that I work at, there's a World Book Online reference section. We have a elementary reference section. There's a curriculum space and culturograms and different things. We have subscription to research databases where kids are able to find articles. We also give them access to the public library options that are in this area. There's an online world atlas that kids can look at, but also groups like National Geographics have available access. They sell National Geographics is the #1 book selling for Atlas, but they also have an online option for kids to learn about the world without having to have a physical concept or a physical manifestation of it. So it's important to acknowledge that there are other options other than just um, a physical copy. And then something that I think is a really important point is that there is just such a fast paced information growth. The way that we intake information now, the way that we procure information is so different than, 15, 20 years ago. So the options are different. So holding on or continuing to hold on to the antiquated concept that only a reference section can be the top authority on information is incredibly incorrect. The great thing about the information growth is that things like, that atlas is being real time updated. So when you have a physical book, the information goes bad. It's like food. You put it in the refrigerator, you let it sit out for too long, it's going to go bad. So, having a book, having a World Atlas from 1993 is not going to have the same information that a World Atlas needs in 2018. But having an online version of a World Atlas from a World Atlas website that is actively updating the information that is less than half of the price of that physical set, that's $1,200. And then you can buy a subscription that's $300 for the next 10 years or for the next 5 years, is an investment in your students' education and the way that they intake information. So the fast paced information growth is really a key factor in whether or not we should continue to keep a reference section. I don't think that it's a viable option because it takes up space. It's not currently being active, it's expensive, and there are other options that are cheaper that our kids already utilize and use and will feel more comfortable with. So like I pointed out, you'll probably get my conclusion before I get to conclusion. I readily think that we do not need a physical reference section in a library. I think that it takes up valuable space. I think that it is a deterrent. I think that kids don't go to it. And while I was raised in a space that did have these books, and I did love sitting down with childcraft and reading it and having that physical sense, the kids nowadays didn't go through that same growth that I did, where I had a physical book. They are used to having a digital version of things, and they know how to utilize that, and that autonomy that they have, that comfortableness that they have with being able to own uh, their own knowledge and own their own growth and learning process is important for us to support. It's so important that we have these real world relevant questions and problems, and that they're accurate and that they're up to date, that the students investigations that build upon prior knowledge is the correct knowledge, and that we give them interactive investigation that can be utilized online. And as much as we would like it to be physical, we have to acknowledge that this generation is extremely digitalized. So having a physical book that I can spend $200 on, or being able to spend $200 on something that my students would like to read, and getting, 20 books over one book, I think I would prefer to spend the 200 bucks on 20 books. It just gives me more students to connect with. It gives me a larger net to pull them in and to interest them. Um, so my conclusion is that I do not think we need a physical reference section in the children's library space. So I'm going to thank you for listening to me. Um, and I hope you have a great night.